I'm really honored to facilitate this panel. I think it's a really important panel in response to the report. I'm going to introduce myself in my language first before I get started. Scano Sokwego, Giaso Gawenkyuse, Ganyangehaga Nyakwai Shautda, Haudenosaunee. Greetings of peace to you. I told you my nation, which is a Mohawk Nation, and Bear Clan. I'm from Six Nations, Grand River Territory, and I live and work in my community. I also work at the University of Windsor. I also work with the Mohawk Institute Survivors Secretariat as their Indigenous Human Rights Monitor. And again, like I said, I'm really honored to be a part of this panel, but I'm also just going to say a few words first before I introduce them. So I graduated law school in 1994, and when I graduated law school, it was probably the worst experience that I ever had to learn about colonial law and its being used as a tool to assimilate our people, to cause violence against our people. And so when this report came out, it was, yes, the truth. Something that finally has some teeth and some tools to use against Canada for what it's done to our people. And acknowledging our ancestors here, the territory, Algonquin territory and ancestors. My real name, Gawenkyuse, means she's visiting. And so anywhere I go, I'm a visitor. And so I'm feeling that today, and I wanted to honor the survivors, honor you, and honor our residential school ancestors, our babies that we've lost. And so when I talk about this work, it's difficult, it's emotional, it's spiritual. It's a really difficult subject to talk about because it's so personal to each of us. It's personal to me. My grandmother and all of her siblings attended the Mohawk Institute, so I've experienced the impact of that. But I was also raised very traditionally in my community at Six Nations with our longhouse ceremonies, so I feel very privileged to do that and to be able to be raised that way. But when I did graduate law school, I said that I would do all I could to help our people and that I would use those skills that I was taught. And so when, in my last year of law school, I attended and went to and clerked with the Supreme Court judges in Yellowknife. And I had to write a major research paper, and I wrote about the residential schools then. And I was writing about the genocide of our people, and I wanted to write exactly what was in this report about how this is crimes against humanity, this is genocide. But my professor at the time in 1994 said, "Sorry, you can't write about that. We don't want to know about that." And so I had to take it out. I had to take it out because I wanted to pass. They wouldn't have passed me if I left it in. So that's why I'm saying, like, I'm totally celebrating this report, and thanks to my Mohawk sister Kim for all of the work that she's done over the last 2 years. And you know, she was the lead for the Mohawk Institute Survivors Secretariat and developed my position, the Indigenous Human Rights Monitor. and working with the survivors and the board of the Mohawk Institute Secretariat. So I really am honored and thank her for all of the work and the team for doing this. And it's important. This is really important, important work. As an academic, you rely on these kinds of things. So this panel today is focused on chapters 2 and 5 of this report. So the panelists here will be presenting on that. And one of the things that I've always said in teaching now, so I teach first-year law, all first-year law students about Indigenous legal orders and talk about our laws and respecting our laws and where we come from and our history and our treaties and our language. All of our laws that we have, I focus on Haudenosaunee law, and we have other professors that present and speak about Anishinaabe law and Cree law. So it's being taught by practitioners of our own laws, those of us that attend ceremony and we've been raised with our laws. And so it's interesting that it's mandatory, and it became mandatory because the faculty supported it. So all first-year law students are learning about this. And I'm really excited because they're excited about it. And they're learning about colonial Canadian law and our laws. And they're totally shifting and understanding the differences in the worldviews. So then I moved on to do my master's in law, and I did focus on international law and Haudenosaunee law, and that our law is international law. And that international human rights, even way back when, I said this is what we need to use in order to bring attention and to address these issues with Canada. Because Canada has gotten away with murder. Canada's gotten away with their genocidal policies. They need to be held accountable. They've gotten away with it for way too long. And this is why was my response to Harper's apology way back when, was I never accepted it. I thanked him for it. But what I did say at the end was, so what are you going to do about it, Canada? What are you going to do about it? And they've made things worse for us, even since then. And so this is a tool that we need to use to bring Canada to be accountable to the world. This needs to go to the world stage. This needs to go to the international criminal courts. We need to stop thinking that Canada is going to help us, because they're not going to help us. I'm sorry. In all of the 30 years I've been doing this and studying Canada, studying their laws, studying the intentions of their laws, and I was, again, I don't think I was disappointed about Canada's response yesterday. It was expected. It was expected because they don't care. They really don't. So when I decided to focus on teaching, I've been trying to teach for a long time and focus on educating all over, anywhere I go. When I was president of the Native Women's Association of Canada, it became quite obvious that they have no clue. They have no clue about who we are, our history. They've never been educated, and I've seen it in the education system that they do not know They don't have the tools to teach about our people. So I'm really, again, I'm going to use this in my courses. I have been looking and researching how to bring a claim against Canada, trying to bring a team together. There's been a few already that have brought claims, but it's not really going too far. But this is one of the tools. So I'm really happy. I just wanted to introduce that and acknowledge Kim and the report and all of the work she's done, the amazing work. And you know, sometimes we get into trouble when we're together. People get kind of scared when we're together. But that's fine, eh, Kim? So anyway, I want to introduce our panel. So this is on enforced disappearances and settler amnesty, chapter 2 and 5 from the book. So we have Dr. Mark Kirsten. He's an assistant professor of criminology and criminal justice at the University of Fraser Valley. Fanny LaFontaine, she's a Canada Research Chair in International Criminal Justice and Human Rights. And also we have former National Chief, Ovid McCurdy. So they're going to present in that order. I'm really excited to hear their voice today. And I'm just going to hand it over to them. So they're going to present one right after the other. And then if we have time for questions, we will. So we'll see how it goes. Okay, Yawa, thank you.
Thank you very much. It's an incredible honor for me to be here. And thank you to the special interlocutor, Kimberly Murray, and congratulations on your report. And thank you for letting me be part of this incredible effort. And thanks as well to Kirsten Manley, Casimir, and to Paulette Regan for their love and kindness. I've worked for a long time on international law, and this was the most meaningful work and professional experience I've ever had, was being part of that team. I want to explain and reiterate a couple of key points that we heard yesterday in relation to enforced disappearances and settler amnesty, and I'll try and go through it methodically and as clearly as possible. When we were working and researching, we were trying to think about what different words meant. And of course, one of the key words that we were looking at was the word missing. And missing is a very appropriate word because it centers the person who is doing the missing. However, what it doesn't tell us is why somebody went missing, why they may have vanished, who is responsible for them going missing. And what we found was that in certain instances, states around the world, including states like Mexico, actually use the word missing to avoid giving themselves a sense of accountability or responsibility for making people go missing. But there is a different word that can also describe someone who has gone missing for wrongful reasons, and that's disappearance. So we thought of the word disappearance, and indeed enforced disappearance, because it highlights that Canada is responsible for the fact that the children went missing. Canada, as the report concludes, has committed enforced disappearances. But what exactly is an enforced disappearance? The key elements are put forward in many different places, but include the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. You may have heard that enforced disappearances have happened in World War II with the Nazis. They were particularly notorious in Latin America, but they happen all of the time. They are a very common feature of human rights violations, and they're happening in Sudan, Gaza, and Ukraine. There are four key elements, four key factors to understanding whether or not something was an enforced disappearance or not. The first is, was there a deprivation of liberty? Was somebody's liberty deprived? And in the context of the Indian residential school system, the answer is absolutely yes. The children's liberty was completely deprived. They could not leave. They were forced into the institutions. And I want to highlight something important here. The late Indigenous legal scholar Harold Johnson said that all of the atrocities that were committed against Indigenous people were justified in Canadian law. Under enforced disappearances law, it doesn't matter if a child was taken at a time when it was legal to take the child. The deprivation of liberty, the taking of a child could have been legal at the time. It may still be an enforced disappearance. So that feature is satisfied. The second feature, there has to be state authorization, support, or acceptance of the fact that the enforced disappearance is taking place. That's met too. It was the state that took the children away. It was law enforcement like the RCMP. That condition is met as well. 3, there has to be a refusal to acknowledge that someone has had their liberty deprived, and there has to be a concealment of the fate of the disappeared person. Again, easily satisfied. Canada would not admit that it stole children. It still hasn't provided all of the evidence that it has, and neither have the churches. That third element is satisfied. And the last one is that the person who's disappeared has to be placed outside of the protection of the law. Of course the children were placed outside of the protection of the law. When they did come forward to prosecutors, to law enforcement agencies to say, this happened to me, that happened to someone I loved, they weren't believed. All elements of an enforced disappearance at international law are satisfied. Now, there's a difference between enforced disappearances under international human rights law and international criminal law. And under international human rights law, there are 3 additional important things to know about an enforced disappearance. 1 is that they are a human rights violation, but they also include, as the special interlocutor said yesterday, other human rights violations. Violations of the right to life, violations of the right not to be subjected to cruel, unusual punishment or torture, violations of the right to an identity, violations of the right to education. Second, enforced disappearances are continuous human rights violations. No statute of limitations applies to a disappearance. They do not end. The human rights violation does not end until a victim is returned to their family or community, or that their whereabouts are established by the state. And 3, victims of the enforced disappearance at international law include, of course, the person who was disappeared, but also include the families and communities of the disappeared person. They too are owed remedies and reparations. And as the special interlocutor's report concludes, there are grounds to believe, and I believe that it is a very strong case, an exceptionally strong case, to believe that Canada is responsible for the enforced disappearance of Indigenous children as a human rights violation. The state has a duty to investigate impartially and properly. It can't do so because it's Canada. It must support Indigenous-led investigations. And the families of the disappeared are owed remedies and reparations because they too are victims of enforced disappearances in Canada. At international criminal law, an enforced disappearance can be a crime against humanity if 2 things are true: that the enforced disappearances are perpetrated as 1, part of a widespread or systematic attack, and 2, that the perpetrators of the enforced disappearances had knowledge that there was an attack against a particular group of people. Now, it's difficult right now to know for sure whether crimes against humanity, whether enforced disappearances as a crime against humanity, are a continuous crime and whether a body like the International Criminal Court would accept that victims of the crime against humanity of enforced disappearances include family members and communities. But we put forward, and the Special Interlocutor's report puts forward very carefully an analysis that says, yes, it should, because international criminal law must be in line with international human rights law. And after careful analysis, the Special Interlocutor's report finds and concludes that enforced disappearances have been committed as crimes against humanity under international criminal law. They were not just systematic or widespread. They were systematic and widespread. Now, I want to take this moment to briefly clarify why it's important what the word crimes against humanity means. The report of the Special Interlocutor also pays a lot of attention to the question of genocide and genocidal acts, and appropriately so. Crimes against humanity came up in history at the same time as the crime of genocide. And while genocide, as we all know, focuses on the particular harms committed against a group with the intent to destroy that group in whole or in part, crimes against humanity tell a little bit of a different story. Crimes against humanity are so egregious that they're crimes against all of us. They are crimes against our common humanity. So some will read the report or listen to the Special Interlocutor yesterday and ask, how did we not know about enforced disappearances? Why are we just hearing about this now? And one reason is because of what the report calls a settler amnesty. We know, thanks to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, the testimony of survivors, that atrocities committed in Canada were both structural and systematic. Now, Canada, though, does a very good job at dividing and conquering issues of accountability. Some justice here, some acknowledgement over there. Nothing wholesale, nothing comprehensive. We were interested in trying to figure out what explained impunity in this country, the lack of justice and accountability for atrocities committed against the Indigenous children. And the report concludes that just like the atrocities were systematic and structural, impunity in Canada is systematic and structural. And that is embodied in the idea of a settler amnesty and a culture of impunity. Now, amnesties, for those of you who may not be familiar with the term, are government actions that protect specific perpetrators from prosecution. They're often used in peace negotiations or transitions from dictatorships to democracy. Some of them are good. The South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission offered perpetrators amnesty if they testified genuinely before the TRC there. But some are terrible. Some are just excuses for people to protect themselves from accountability. We studied amnesties and found that it exists in Canada, but in a different form, in the form of a settler amnesties. Amnesties can be differentiated on 4 bases that the Special Interlocutor discussed yesterday. Some cover everyone, blanket amnesties. Other are only granted to certain people, perhaps lower level perpetrators. Some are conditional, for example, on whether someone testifies and offers truth in relation to their atrocities. Some are completely unconditional. You don't have to do anything to get them. Some are written in law and passed as legislation, and so are transparent, and others are just de facto, the result of a complete lack of interest in accountability. And some are given by states to themselves, or to their own perpetrators, and some are given to their adversaries. What the report found was that Canada's settler amnesty is a blanket, unconditional amnesty, not written in law, given by Canada to all senior level perpetrators of atrocities committed in the Indian residential school system. How do we know this? Let's return to enforced disappearances for a moment. And I'll describe 3 acts and omissions which describe how this settler amnesty operates and that are articulated in the final report. 1, Canada has steadfastly refused to sign and ratify the 2006 International Convention on the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances. And stop me if you've heard this before, but it's happy to tell other countries to sign and ratify that convention. It just won't do it itself. 2, when Canada adopted the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court into its own domestic legal code in the year 2000 through the War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity Act, it didn't include enforced disappearances under crimes against humanity, despite the fact that it is there in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Not only that, though, Canada also guaranteed that if a crime against humanity, like an enforced disappearance, happened outside of the country, Canada could investigate and prosecute it before the year 2000. If it happened inside of Canada, Canada could only investigate and prosecute them if it happened after the year 2000. 3. Canada has refused to sign and ratify the American Convention on Human Rights or accept the jurisdiction of the Inter-American Court on Human Rights. Why is that important? Because both have played a critical role in addressing enforced disappearances, including in relation to Indigenous peoples. And in 2003 and in 2005, the Senate of Canada told the government there's no good reason not to sign and ratify the American Convention. The only reasonable conclusion to this history is that it's intentional, that it's an intentional desire to remove accountability and remove avenues of accountability for victims and survivors of enforced disappearances and other atrocities associated with the Indian residential school system. The consistent refusal to provide avenues for accountability is purposeful. It is systemic and it is structural. It's a pattern, and it represents a culture of impunity. And the report captures this under the concept of settler amnesty, one that must be dismantled if a real transition to something else, something different from what Canada has been while committing these atrocities is possible, and if meaningful, comprehensive accountability is to be achieved. Thank you very much.
Quay, bonjour, hello. I can't tell you how big an honor it is for me to be here and to see some familiar faces, some new faces. I am in admiration of your work, Kim, and I'm very happy to meet you officially. This report is historic, I believe. It adds to previous reports, but it bears a specific voice, a very special voice, all of your voices, survivors, and it has this particularity of not only building on previous work by the TRC, by the National Inquiry, but on bringing new vocabulary to facts that are well known by survivors and more by the Canadian public. But this is a tremendous contribution to bring in the term of enforced disappearance, of crimes against humanity, in addition to repeating the term genocide to what happened here in Canada. So for that, I thank you, miigwech. Thank you. What you've done in naming what happened in the residential schools in Unmarked death and to call it enforced disappearance was what the National Inquiry has done by calling colonial violence as genocide, what the Truth and Reconciliation did by calling it genocide, or cultural genocide as well, is what we call in international human rights fair labeling. In other words, calling it for what it is. And fair labeling is part of the right to truth, which is core in your report. And the right to truth includes obviously everything that you've mentioned and knowing the whereabouts and everything that you've mentioned, but also calling what happened with the right legal qualification. This comes with particular legal consequences, obviously, but also represents rightly the experience of the survivors. So that's why using the right words, the words of the survivors, but using it in a proper legal qualification, I think is key. So I think, again, that by using that in your report, you're making a great contribution. Now, the previous panel talked about denialism, and I'm sorry, with my French mouth, this is probably one of the hardest words to pronounce in English, denialism. The second one being interlocutor. So I promised myself I would try to say that, and I would call you Kim in front of you. So the previous panel talked about denialism, but with fair labeling of what I was talking about, using right legal qualification to talk about facts, about human experiences, comes with legal denialism. Mark talked about why what happened is crimes against humanity, and I won't get back to that, but the same happened when, for example, the National Inquiry came with the term, not came with the term, but again came with the term genocide to qualify what the survivors had described in their testimonies, and Kim, you referred to that extensively in your report as well. So what was the reaction of the media after the TRC used cultural genocide, or the National Inquiry used genocide, or Kim used enforced disappearance and genocide? Wow, come on. It's not the Holocaust. Oh yeah, sure, it was bad, but not that bad, right? And so as law professors, and you've mentioned this, Bev and Mark as well, and Ovid and everyone here who have one of the biggest default of being a lawyer, one of our biggest tasks is to fight against denialism in a general sense, but also legal denialism. So not only to call it for what it is, to use the proper words, but also to fight when lawyers or the public try to deny the fact that the term is used rightfully. In this case, crimes against humanity, enforced disappearance, and genocide. Now, we do that in law schools, and in the previous panel, I think Tanya asked the question whether there was hope. There is a bit of hope. You mentioned this, Bev. We teach more and more about the truth of residential schools and colonial violence in universities and schools all across Canada. In law schools, we teach about more and more about Indigenous legal traditions and the impact of colonialism on current legal systems. But let me tell you, one of the main problems of teaching international law and talking about international legal terms in terms of the reality of the situation in Canada is for one international lawyer to talk about international law. The problem is we're stuck with international law. And as you mentioned, Bev, international law is probably like Canadian colonial law, but is probably the archetype of the Eurocentric legal system, colonial system. International law is based on the very idea of the sovereign nation state, which was built on robbing sovereign nations, indigenous peoples, of their lands. So the whole system is based on a fallacy, essentially. So we have to either try to decolonize it, and we try, and you do, and everybody does, but also work within what is existing to sort of try to see what's there and try to work within it. And there's a lot of people working on it. One of the things that was done in this report that Kim's has produced with an amazing team, apparently one of them, amazing partner, is here on the stage, and I hear the rest of them was pretty great too, so congrats for that too. This is the good quality of a leader, right, to get surrounded by a great team. So one of the terms of international law which comes back a lot, and we've talked about it in the previous panels, is genocide. And one of the questions, well, how do we fight denialism that genocide has occurred in Canada? When I started learning law and international law in law school, and Bev, we were about in the same years. You know, it was the mid-1990s. The genocide against the Tutsis in Rwanda was happening. They created two international tribunals in the aftermath of Nuremberg, but 50 years later. So genocide was massacres. Nobody in the law schools were referring to this emerging body of law to criminalize the most egregious violations of international law as to what happened here in Canada. So one of the tasks of fighting legal denialism is to teach, is how genocide, the terms as exist right now in international law applies to what happened here in Canada and to what continues to happen. This, what I'm showing you, is a sort of booklet that is available. I can send the details somehow, but a booklet that explains with graphic sort of details how the current legal definition of genocide applies to colonial violence in Canada, including residential schools, including the sexual violence, including forced starvation, including numerous acts, and explains why it is legitimate to use the term as it currently is. Because the term was drafted by colonial powers. The term of the Convention Against Genocide of 1948 was drafted by sovereign states, and settler colonial states fought very hard to exclude some acts of cultural genocide, they called, which was envisaged as genocide initially, and exclude them because obviously they were very concerned that this would apply to Canada. So the current definition is imperfect, largely imperfect. It excludes acts that should be considered as genocide, like the destruction of churches and cultural artifacts and other stuff like that. But the current definition still works. It includes 5 acts, and you know them. And one of them is very well known, it's murder. That's fine, we know that. But this is one of the problems with genocide, and that's why the reaction and that denialism is it's denialism. See how I mess up the word every time I try to say it? Is so strong, is that the word genocide is often and always in the general public associated with the Holocaust paradigm. Time-intensive massacres of murders, like 800,000 Tutsis in Rwanda in 8 months. This is what people have associated with genocide, but it includes 4 other acts: inflicting bodily or mental harm, imposing conditions of life calculated to bring destruction, restricting births, forced sterilization, transferring children. These are all still in the definition. And these have to be committed against a specific group with the intent to destroy. And one of the arguments that has been used in Canada to deny the application of genocide to what happened here in Canada against Indigenous peoples is this notion of destruction. And you know that argument. It was not to destroy them, it was to, yeah, we all know it, right? That's the dumbest argument you can ever have heard. Because there is no distinction, there is no difference. You mentioned in your report, and it's so important, how the legalistic sort of, I don't know, you used a better word because you're better generally, but also in English, how these legalistic arguments are brought about to disqualify the application of international law to facts that actually apply. So one of the examples is that destruction. So the destruction of a group is, of course, can be physical by murder. It can be biological by preventing births. But it can also be destruction of the group as the group, for what it constitutes the group, what makes it, the group, the nation, indigenous, social fabric. By destroying the social fabric of the group, you destroy the group as a social unit. You destroy it as, and you know that better than anyone else, but it has to be repeated again and again, because that's the kind of argument that is brought forward in the media by our peers. Lawyers told us we were, right? What are the arguments? We're just activists. We're not based on real law, but this is wrong. And this is what I think your report and other reports in the past and the work that you're doing and that we're all doing contributes to doing, unpacking how the violence that is past and ongoing in Canada qualifies as genocide, as crimes against humanity, and an enforced disappearance. So I think there is hope, and I was very honored to participate in this gathering and to see and to honor the voices of the survivors. With legal qualifications come legal obligations for the state of Canada, for individuals eventually, and you made it very clear, obligations owed to entire communities, to the survivors first and foremost. And where I see hope is that there are numerous, despite denialism, thank you, despite this, despite the rise of denialism in Canada, there's also a rise, I think, of non-Indigenous allies and people who, in classroom, in the media, and the general public, are there to walk side by side with survivors to get those reparations and remedies that are needed. Thank you. Miigwech.
Misipaistigu inunina Egutegu Pigian. I'm from Grand Rapids. That's where I was raised. It's in the province of Manitoba. Megos euxpi kigi maskaisi no. Wanagi orgi wanitana euxpi. Pakal magi sanagan megots anus. Maga tagusistayak po egata pagichiak. In those days, things were very different. I'm talking about a long time ago here. I was born in 1946. Our people were pretty intact, strong, and they had a livelihood. While they may have experienced oppression, it was not visible in terms of social problems that we experience today. It was a different time when people knew who they were and they understood what their destiny was, and they were determined to fulfill it. But it looks different today because many of the atrocities have been uncovered within the last 40 years. Phil Fontaine has to be complimented 1,000 times for raising the issue of residential schools that led to this conversation we're having right now. And I, like many other people, will lift up Kim Murray for the rest of the time. Because the approach you took to deal with this issue of missing children, an unmarked grave, was not a traditional approach in white academia. Look at the people here. It was inclusive. You went to the communities and you engaged the people directly. Why it is now possible for me to predict that the energy will not fail us. The energy that you produced will not fail us. We will rise. We will return to that time when we were still strong people. And I wanted to also say that Pakan Histano, we are different as a people. The Inuit have their identity, their own destiny, as do the Métis Nation, and us as the original people of this country. Pakan Histano, we are different too. And one of those differences is not part of the law of the country. You see, we can't define ourselves and we can't find our strategy totally within their society because of what was said earlier by the two speakers. We are not talking about our legal system, we're talking about theirs. And there's only so much that we can accomplish in terms of transforming that system when the reluctance is there and the dismissiveness is there. Why, in your report, I applaud the fact that you say to our people, to the Inuit, the Métis, and the First Nations, make your own laws. Make your own laws. When I was working on trying to change the country some 40 years ago in something called the constitutional process, to identify and define our rights for inclusion in the supreme law of this country, I got to meet some very strong leaders. And I want to mention two of them in particular because it adds to what I'm going to say. John Amagolic, Mary Simon, Zebedee Nongak. These are people of substance. They had a belief that the promise of reforming the country was possible. They came there with their full energy to change the country, as we all did, until we were betrayed by failure. Not our failure, but the failure of white society, the failure of the country. John Amagolic, during the Meech Lake Accord, I don't know if the young people here remember this, but the Meech Lake Accord was about trying to make the family whole again, the Federation family, the federal family, the people of Quebec and the rest of the country. And that the effort was to make them feel comfortable within Canada, an effort that's never been made for us. An effort to say to them, you are a distinct people, you deserve the term distinct society. John Amagolic said, probably one of the most profound things that you can say about that, with these words: if Quebec is a distinct society, what are we? Chopped liver? You see, the brilliance of our people is always there. We march with that brilliance. We never abandon it. We move forward. And then John Amagolic was one of those people that represented his people with pride, with strength, with absolute determination. And then there was another young man, Zebedee Nongak. And then we were dealing with the premiers and the prime minister at the time, and they were not keen to change the country. They were in a position of power and authority, and they saw us as pure supplicants, beggars in our country. And they had no interest in changing the Federation. So John Amagolic would try to make them feel more comfortable. He would always try to say to them, we're trying to help you improve the country. And these are his words that I'm going to repeat now. He said to these leaders, these white leaders from the provinces and Canada, we're not trying to destroy your country. We're trying to destroy the status quo. Now, the brilliance is there. Like most of our lives, we have tried to accommodate the society that has suppressed us. We have come with all kinds of terminology to make them feel confident and comfortable. So in my time, in the leadership role nationally, instead of using the word sovereignty, we use self-government. Not that we didn't understand sovereignty, but we had to accommodate the fears of these politicians. And now, today, here, as we're gathered, we will remember that we also have our basic human rights. They are not necessarily enshrined in international law. You will not find them in a Charter of Rights and Freedoms of this country, because these human rights are those that we define for ourselves over time, over centuries. And I will only mention two of them. But I challenge the young people here to know their society, to find out what are our human rights as a people. And I begin with probably the primary human right of every tribe, every nation in Canada and the United States, in New Zealand, whatever, any indigenous society, the right to belong. That right to belong was denied those children when they were removed from their community. They were denied to belong to their family, to their community, to their culture, to their way of life. They were denied our basic human right, the right each one of us has, the right to belong. And on top of that, to make matters worse, they were also denied our second fundamental human right as a people, the right to be different. This is a fundamental right that we enjoy as a people. In our society, growing up in Grand Rapids, two-spirited people were never denied their rights. They didn't have to defend themselves. They were just purely accepted because they had the right to belong. And here we have these young children who are in unmarked graves, whose right to be different was removed from them. Because if that right for them to be different had been accepted and honored by the country, there would not be any unmarked graves in this country. They would have returned home, where they would have contributed to the rise of their own society. And instead, now we are here to regret one fact, that we will never know how many geniuses lie in unmarked graves, how many great leaders died in those unmarked graves. We will never know, because their right to be different was denied to them by Canada. Now, I wanted to speak last because I wanted to learn something, and I did. And the two previous speakers, we have to listen to them. And the report is a blueprint, a way forward to deal with that particular matter that's our concern today. Maga ega tapagitsyak, but we cannot give up. Mama we putat skata makuma. We have to work together on this, together. Mama we, together. So I say to all of you, you know who you are. I don't have to tell you what your basic rights are within your society. You know them. But I also understand our dilemma of being a colonized people, of living within a nation-state that assumes full authority on our lands and our resources, and even says can manage our sovereignty. So the challenge is there for the young people to carry on this struggle of finding our own way, not to assimilate, never to fully assimilate, and never to be satisfied with the word integration into white society. Pakan kista now. We are different too. Euksiputay kinoapiak. That's how we have to look at ourselves. Egata pagitsyak, and never to surrender that right to be different in this country. Kagaskita no mga anutaman. I know we can accomplish this. In the last 40 years, there has been a progress of the mind, a progress of the intellect, a progress of knowledge. We see it here with our young people, in the thousands, not just the hundreds, but in the thousands. We have to motivate them. We have to say to them, you are our future. Become what you can be to protect the people. Be the leader you were born to be to rise our nations. This is what we have to say to all of them. And those of us here in this room, those of you who have gray hair, and you'll notice I have a few too. And someone says you're dyeing hair, and I say, never. But we're the elders now, the knowledge keepers. We're the teachers now. It's not enough now just to sit back and relax in our old age. We have to remember, as young people, we have the energy to represent our people. Now let's revive that energy, and let's work with these young people so they will have the power to represent our people. We need our own schools of political advocacy, our schools about the treaties, our schools about the impact of colonization. We need schools, and we are the schools. Schools don't have to be a building. It doesn't have to be a structure. A school is a thought, a belief, an understanding, a sharing. That's a school. And that is what we are. Kipitay na om sa mga namutaman, you hear me what I'm saying. Itigil sa inimi ani nasa. I am getting old now. Magamot cheskon di pagichinista, but I will never surrender. I will never surrender. So let's go international. Yes, let's go to international. Let's use the vehicles that are there, even if we're denied access to them. Let's go there anyway. And let's learn from the tribes that have done that in the past. Those who have marched diligently, deliberately to accomplish the UNDRIP that took them at least 4 decades. Like the Mohawk Nation and the Cree Nation and all the different nations that joined forces to make UNDRIP a reality in this country now. We still do not have a place in the United Nations, that is true. It's not that it was not ever asked for or tried. It has been asked for and tried many times. But let's try again. Let's break open the membership of the United Nations. It is simply composed of nation states, but nation states don't represent us as a people. We have a right to be there to represent ourselves in the international community. But also, let's not limit our international gaze to the United Nations because, as you can see, it is not that effective either. It has not prevented war, for example, and it has not eliminated discrimination against people, and it has not improved religious tolerance. It has a weakness, because the weakness is inherent in the structure, because the structure is made of nation states who have vested interests. That's its basic weakness. So let's not limit our international advocacy to the UN. Let's hold our colonizer accountable. And those of you who have treaties, post-Confederation treaties, you will know that those treaties were made in the name of Queen Victoria, not in the name of John A. Macdonald. So we should go to London and try to get access to their parliament, launch a case in the House of Lords if we have to, but at least talk to the King, Charles, and insist on reparation. Not apology, but reparation. My knowledge is not up to par these days. But I know that my children, who are both lawyers, are up there in their knowledge level. And I know that even in my own immediate family, and also my extended family with all my siblings, all my nephews, and all my nieces, there's a power there. It's a power not latent. It's a power rising. And I know that they will make a great difference to their community, but that they will not focus just to their community. They will focus on the idea of the nation itself. We have to open our eyes, people. No community is a nation. But the Anishinaabe are a nation. The Mohawk, the Dakota, the Anishinaabe, the Innuit, the Dene, the Inuit, that's the nation. And that is where those young people who are now so qualified, far more than I am, are going to place their energies. They will work with you, with the academic community. And they will create new allies that we do not have right now. Because out there in the population called Canada, we have allies here and there, but they're sparse and far in between. So it is our mandate, in fact, our duty, to make allies. We've been sitting in our couches far too long about that issue of creating allies. We need public support for many of the measures that Kim is advocating for us. We need public support. And therefore, since Canada is always evolving in terms of its population, we can't limit our allies just to white people. I think there is as many as 17 million people who are not white living in Canada, if not more. We need to reach out to them. We need to educate them. We need to teach them. But they also have to appreciate that whatever action we ask of them, it'll be Indigenous-led, not led by them. MAGA. So I was asked, how much time do you need to speak? I said, not very long. But you know what? I've lied many times before. So I'll stop there before I have to tell in more. You heard what I said. And you heard it from my friend. Don't trust the country. We can't trust the country. That country has been sitting on treaties 1 to 11 for 150 years. We can't trust them. But it does not mean that we cannot mobilize to force them to do the right thing. And one of the things I will close with is that growing up in Mississippi, in Grand Rapids, I did not know ceremony. I was raised as a Catholic. And my understanding of Catholicism, in fact, of Christianity, is all about truth and love and understanding. It's all the idea of respecting and loving your neighbor, and also this idea of forgiveness. But why is it so absent in the country that claims to be a Christian country? I never fully understand that. Maybe there's more to it than just religion. It may be the color of our face. It may be something as ugly as racism. But also, it may be even something more sinister. Like, we stole your land, we're not going to give it back to you. We know we stole your land, but we're not going to admit it. This idea that I am full of guilt, but I'm not going to experience it, and my way of not experiencing it is denial and dismissiveness. So that might be part of it too, I think. Gusto makakinasamit na.
Yeah, well, thank you to these panelists for educating us and empowering us. So we have some time for questions, comments, a little bit of time. So just, I think, in the meantime, while you're thinking of your questions, one of the things that I wanted to say about this panel and the strength of the words and the empowerment is that we are brilliant. We've always been brilliant. So we have to use that in what we do in our communities. So we do have some speakers. Doug, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, very good. I speak to you as inmate number 482738, survivor of the Mohawk Institute, maybe the worst of these places of confinement in Canada. But we survived as Akwesasne internees because we engaged in specific acts of defiance, that unless we showed our physical opposition to the brutality, to the rapes, to the other things that happened at the Mohawk Institute, that we would become victims. And it's that lesson that we carried throughout our adult lives, that unless we take a physical stand in defense of our bodies, in defense of our communities, in defense of our nations, then we were reduced to victims. And what I've seen in the last decade is that we have aroused the spirits of the children, that in accordance with some of the most sacred teachings of the Mohawk people, that we address the spirit beings who have gone on and taken that star path. But they have power, and we speak to that power now, here, and we have a moral, spiritual obligation to speak on behalf of those children, but they are not without voice, and we've given them that voice. And through the tremendous work of Kim and her team, we're now unleashing that power. We are now calling those children to respond, and it's our duty to make sure that we give them that voice. The consequences of further denial are going to be very tremendous to all of us and to this planet, that the very survival of human species depends upon reconciliation with the spirit beings and the voices of those children. I'll say this, that 2 years ago, Pope Francis came to Canada, and it was his apology tour. At one point, I insisted to the organizers that they give voice to the Haudenosaunee people, to our Mohawk people. We had been excluded. But when they gave me a response, they said, you have 1 minute to speak to Pope Francis, and I said, that's not sufficient. I refuse to accept his apology unless it's an absolute commitment to the processes of justice, that he will accept full responsibility for the damage and the harm caused to the children. And that response has to be the formation of an independent tribunal composed of Aboriginal people, in which we compel the testimony of those who inflicted the pain upon those children with accordance with the following penalty for the crimes that they have committed. We need to have that tribunal. And 3 years ago when I was on Parliament Hill, I addressed this issue. I said, we need this. We have to have this tribunal. We have to allow and we have to encourage and solicit the words of the victims. And those victims have to be taken, and justice has to be applied in accordance with traditional Indigenous customs. We also said that nothing for us can be done without us. And one of the problems we've had among our Mohawk people is that when they created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they left out certain things. They did not consult with us as to the composition of that tribunal. They humiliated us by compelling us under the independent assessment program to relive testimony before government bureaucrats, not our own people. That humiliation led to the death of many Native people by suicide. That was unacceptable. They omitted, or during that process, the tremendous harm caused to our physical bodies by being exposed to harmful contaminants within the schools. One example, the Mohawk Institute, when a decision had to be made as to whether to destroy that building or restore it, when we agreed that it should stand as a memorial, they found that it was heavily contaminated with all sorts of pollutants that caused tremendous harm to us as children, that the asbestos that we played with in the playroom on the lower level, and the lead pipes from which we drank our water and took our showers. There's been absolutely no mention of that kind of resolution, or that as a cause for some kind of not retribution, but some kind of justice applied in that instance. We asked for and are still seeking a National Museum of Indigenous History comparable to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., to stand as a permanent memorial and a reminder for all those generations in the future that this was an integral part of Canadian history. It needs to be understood. It needs to become a pilgrimage site for all Canadians and for people around the world. So we need to have that singular, standalone institution and not to be buried in the Museum of Canadian History. And then we needed and are seeking an aggressive restoration of our traditional homelands, that there are people in Canada of good heart who will work with us if we have a formula by which they could return their individual properties back to the specific nation from which those properties were stolen. But essentially what is happening here, what I see happening, which is very good, is that we've taken the initiative. None of this could have happened without our insistence. And that, again, is a lesson for all of us. Power concedes nothing without a demand, and we need to engage the federal government by taking specific actions to reclaim our territory, and in the instance of the 150 schools across this country, if it means physical occupation, then that's what we have to do. We have to take direct, unambiguous action in defense of this issue and for the very survival of our people. But we have to be prepared to do just that. And one more thing, a reminder that we have followed the trails of people who have come before us. 100 years ago, one of our great leaders, Deskahe of the Cayuga Nation, and Laura Cornelius Kellogg of the Oneida Nation had made voyages to Europe to try to persuade the League of Nations to acknowledge indigenous rights. So what happened in the UN in 2007 was not in a vacuum, but there's a long history of leadership. And the penalty paid by the people of Auschwitz was tremendous. The response for what Descahe had done in Europe was the forcible occupation of the community of Auschwitz by the RCMP and the confiscation of all of their sacred items. That occupation still exists. In our advocacy as Mohawk people, as members, founding members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, is this: none of this can happen without restoration of Indigenous governance. And we have all been long advocates for that, not band council governments under the Indian Act of Canada, but actual fully functioning nations based upon who they are as truly separate, self-governing, independent entities. That's our commitment. And we're hoping that the gradual realization of Kim's report will lead us to that conclusion. So thank you.
Yeah, what Doug? We'll go to speaker.
Unnusakut Joanna si akamaliw yung nunawut mitapangan akalong ninyo nakaktunga kuyan na may klitamaw nga kitaw yung nakama si budlak pa na kuyari yung mayong Kimberly kuyan na may inawlo amma ang na tamanit tumakkukwilo kuyari wak katamani to amma inusilagayit kuyan na may juwaktak ka. My name is Jonas Akamalik. I'm from Iqaluit, Nunavut. First of all, I'd like to thank, on behalf of Inuit, I'm glad to say I'd like to thank Kimberly for doing the work. And you are always welcome to Iqaluit. At home, we don't knock on the doors. We just go in. So you can just come to Iqaluit anytime. I'm not a lawyer, but my job is to find Inuit graves across Canada, and I deal with 5 provinces and missing children as well with my co-worker. I'm grateful that we have lawyers panel. Obed, thank you for taking care of us with John and JP Tiningwak. I was going to say quite a few, but my main job is to look for Inuit graves across Canada. And 99% of the time, they're unmarked. And I'm glad we have some resources. I deal with cemeteries, and I deal with First Nations Council and the staff. At one point, we accidentally found 7 children buried in Montreal Cemetery on the side of the hill, and they were unmarked. We didn't know about it until the cemetery office told us about them. The only proper thing to do was to hold a proper burial for them. So we sent 7 family members to Montreal. And it cost quite a bit to come from Iqaluit. It's a 3-hour flight. We don't have trains, nor we don't have buses or highway. The only way to come down here is through the airlines. So it cost quite a bit for us to deal with a lot of stuff in southern Canada. Some people will know. However, there's been some ongoing, I'm going to get to my question later on. There's been some ongoing long process legal actions or courts. And I think one of them was dealing with land claims and trying to get a settlement. It took a long time. For us ordinary people, sometimes we end up not caring about what's going on because this process is so long. So to make things short, I just want to ask the panel members, if this report goes to, it's the legal report, I know that. There's a legalities in it. And at some point, it's going to end up in the court, I think. That's what I think it's going to happen, because the lawyers are going to fight. And somebody mentioned that. So, with your expertise as a panel, I just wanted to have an idea. If it goes to the court, how long is it going to take? 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? So I just want a fair answer about how long it might take the government to implement these recommendations. Kuyan nami, takuyon naksigut tatakurang mayugut. I'd like to thank everyone, and we'll see each other when we see each other. Thank you.
Okay, now, do one of you want to answer? Okay, we'll take another question, and then we'll have a response.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
My name's Louis Bellows. I'm the survivor from the Peace River country. I'd like to at this time to thank Ovid and everybody else talking there, all the lawyers, and they did a very fine job. There's one thing I want to bring up. I'm 88 years old, and one of my friends became a priest in Quebec City. He was to be sworn in that day, and he could speak perfect French. And there was 15 bishops to swear him in. And that's when it all started this year. This thing all started that day. What happened was he had his clothes with him, the cloth they call it, to be sworn in. And he could speak perfect French. So he stopped at the door. They were fighting, these 15 bishops. They were fighting over grade 8 and grade 12. We could never go past grade 8. And of course, the grade 8 person won, the head bishop won. He turned around and put his clothes back in the room and came home. You see what I'm getting at? That's where it all started. If they had let us go to grade 12, we would have been like everybody else. We would have been doctors, lawyers, teachers, and everything. And like Ovid said, we need the schools. See, that's where it all started. We need the schools in Canada. You're right, Ovid. Thank you very much.
Now, okay, Cliff.
I'd like to say, first of all, Yonko, I want to give thanks to Kim and all of the organizers for all of your tireless work. It's been a very emotional, ever since we discovered that there were 215 graves that were found on the grounds of the Kamloops the Indian Residential School. Our collective response across, for me, I know, I've been grieving and in mourning since that time. And I refuse to refer to myself as a survivor. We're more like warriors. We came back from the killing fields of Canada's so-called attempt to get us, to educate us. We received an education for sure. There's no doubt about that. And as it was said during the presentations, some of our children who didn't make it back could have been leaders. They could have been, who knows what they could have been. And that was denied them. You know, I attended the conference last year about upholding Indigenous laws. And my question to the churches is, you know, one of God's laws is thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not steal. The lands that they killed our children on were stolen from our people. And as it turns out, you know, based on some of the people who actually witnessed it, a lot of our children were actually murdered and killed. So if they can violate their own laws to God, lying to us is a walk in the park. I'm a little bit emotional right now. I'm angry about the fact that, you know, we're in real time witnessing a genocide. So to have Canada come here yesterday and not really acknowledge, you know, what we brought to them or what Kim and all of the people have brought to the government of Canada in terms of what they're, you know, they have blood on their hands. And, but to come here and denigrate the graves of our unmarked graves in the burial sites that proliferate the land at these residential schools, it's a shame. And, you know, because of our experience, our collective experience, we need to acknowledge that, you know, we're witnessing a genocide right now. And so I have, you know, the utmost concern and regard for the people in Palestine, for the fact that they're being literally bombarded, including with billions of dollars of contributions from Canada. Yeah, we survived. We're going on 200 years. When I've been saying that, you know, the Mohawk Institute, which was thought of as being the oldest residential school in Canada, was actually built in 1828. It was opened in 1831. But Canada didn't even become a country until 1867. And so, yeah, we do need to go to the UK. So how is it that, I'm asking these, they're kind of rhetorical questions, but you know, we've seen what happened with South Africa. They went through a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, just the same as we did. But, you know, they were able to have the dismantling of the system of apartheid, their racist laws, and yet we still continue. And they came to Canada, by the way, to study the Indian affairs and residential schools and the so-called, you know, the process of accomplished through residential schools to segregate our children and our people. And so they came here and learned how to imply their segregation policies in apartheid. And so the United Nations, through the Security Council, started a process to require the dismantling in 1994 of the system of apartheid by South Africa. And here we are, you know, 30 years later, and we're still dealing with the aftermath of the residential schools that were, yeah, so there's a lot of questions that we need to answer. So this can't be the end of a process. It took 200 years for them to do what they've done, or it's going on 200 years. So if the Mashol was built in 1828 and it's now 2024, in 4 more years, it's going to be 200 years since we felt the impact of these residential schools. And so how can Canada expect in 2 years to do a process through the office of what Kim's doing, through the office of the special interlocutor, and expect that 2 years later, we can just go home and say, our work is done. It's only begun, barely. And so I've been calling for a permanent forum regarding the office of the special interlocutor, and it shouldn't be done until we've discovered all of our children and decided what we're going to do with them, if we're going to bring them home or what we want to do. Those questions we can't answer because it hasn't happened yet. And so, anyway, I just want to say I'll go to everybody and wish you all well in your work, and we need to continue the work, and we can't let up on it. Thank you. Tack Jansson.
Yeah, Wycliffe. I'm really sorry, but I've been told that we have to close. Okay.
Chuck, thank you very much. Very quickly, to the legal people sitting there, with the concept of the rule of law, and in respect to beyond reasonable doubt, and it's true we have a beyond reasonable doubt case about our ancestors and our families. But there's something that I heard in your presentation that I was very curious about. It's something that you did not say that I want to find out. With the concept of hope, but with your understanding and your experience in the international law world and the United Nations, I seem to be hearing that it's unlikely we're going to succeed at the highest level of justice, considering how your world and your language, in the name of law, and the use of words defining the law of what is and who is it for. What did you not say? What is your implication about the final report in terms of hope, in terms of quote unquote genocide or guilty beyond reasonable doubt against the government and the people that did this wrong? That's your question. Am I sharing to my brothers and my sisters here? I think I have to leave this with you because I have to catch a flight. We have to go home to our pipes. We cannot fight the language of legal stuff. It's not our way. But we can sit down with the pipe, the rattle, songs, and everything else that come with it. And ask the right people, and not the lawyers, but our grandfathers and our grandmothers to guide us and to lead us the way, because that is our way. That is something we need to do. That is something we must do. A long time ago, our people that rode horses, that fought the cavalry, they all died for us. And what comes to mind is the Wounded Knee that happened. It just might happen again. It just might happen again. But there needs to be a campaign of truth. The public opinion court is more powerful than being in the actual court, because the people's voices are very powerful and we are strong. As Ovid said, we need to get off our couches and stand up and do something and be role models for the young people so that they can continue that campaign of truth. But first and foremost, let's remember what we were told by our parents and grandparents. They said, Chesqua, wait. They always told us, be careful before you take action, but think about it. Give it an answer 2 or 3 days' time. That's why we have 4 days of preparation before the ceremonies. And that's why we have the 4 doorways in a sweat. There's a teaching there for us to consider and to take home with us.
Those are good closing words, Nyama. We're not going to go anymore. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you for your comments.